let's get rolling. So one of the things we've done every week is to start off with our goals overall. We're trying to tackle two main objectives. The first one is to read Old Testament stories and then not only discover the truth we find in them, but start to try to figure out together how we apply the truth we find in these Old Testament stories. Over the last few weeks, one of the things that I've been doing is kind of hanging out on YouTube, watching a bunch of people talk about Bible stories. And one of the things that I've found fascinating is the number of atheists that are posting on YouTube talking about how crazy Christianity is and how crazy Christians are. And one of the things that I've seen consistently in a series of different videos by a series of different men essentially arguing the apologetics of atheism is they constantly are referencing the fact that Christians will negate the Old Testament in arguments. So they'll be in a discussion, they'll bring up a point from the Old Testament, an atheist will bring up a point from the Old Testament, and the Christian's response to that is, oh, well, that's the Old Testament. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't really count. And I wanted to take just a second and talk about that, because I think if you're watching and hanging with me, and you have been for several weeks, you probably don't buy into that. But regardless, I want to jump on this just for a second, because there is nothing in the scriptures that would give us the indication that it's okay to negate what we find in the Old Testament. In fact, the exact opposite is true. So we find Jesus in the New Testament talking about the Old Testament, and what he says is, I haven't come to get rid of any of this. I'm simply the fulfillment of what you've already seen. And in fact, Jesus had a text that he studied and learned to live the life he lived from, and that text was our Old Testament. If Jesus didn't have the Old Testament, it's pretty safe to argue he would have had no system to build what we call the Christian faith on. And in addition, one of the things that I think has made this such a prominent way for Christians to interact with the Old Testament is because we can read the Old Testament and see God as vengeful and angry and destructive. He's on his behalf. We watch people slaughter nations and kill other people and do crazy, seemingly horrific acts. And so it's hard, it's difficult for a Christian to be approached with this and have someone say to you, like, why does God do all these horrible things in the Old Testament? He's mean and vengeful. And the easy response is, well, that's the Old Testament. It doesn't really count because Jesus showed up, and now that Jesus came, God is suddenly loving and kind and merciful where he didn't used to be. And man, I'm not sure I could say this intensely enough to make it mean what I mean. Because if that's your interaction with the Old Testament, we need to seriously educate ourselves on what we find in these first books of our Bible and what they mean and why they still matter. Now, that's important, but I think it's also important that we understand that the text tells us over and over again in both the Old Testament and the New Testament that our God does not change. That he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so if that's true, then our viewpoint that says the Old Testament God is different from the New Testament God is a perspective problem. And I don't want to dig into this too much other than to just say kind of in passing that if the God in the Old Testament was not merciful and kind and loving, the second Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the garden, they would have been dead. Because he told them, if you make this choice, death follows. And that's not just my opinion, that's a scholarly understanding of what happens in the Garden of Eden, that God demonstrates grace and mercy to Adam and Eve by not immediately slaughtering them for breaking his command. So much so, actually, that the first sacrifice ever, the first blood sacrifice ever happens immediately after that, where God creates them clothing by killing an animal. So you have a picture in the very first story, really, of our Old Testament of God acting graciously and with mercy. But when we jump to the book of Revelation at the end, if you think the New Testament God does not carry himself with intense vengeance and it's sometimes what can seem like anger, then you haven't read the book of Revelation, right? God circles back around in Revelation to some of the things that we see in the Old Testament that are hard to understand, and we find them again. Now, that can only make sense if we are willing to stop and say, look, Old Testament God, New Testament God, same God. And if I'm in a discussion with someone who says to me, well, how do you defend the Old Testament God? And I don't know the answer, defending him by saying, well, the Old Testament doesn't count is absolutely wrong. The only appropriate response to that, if I don't know what to say, is, gosh, do you know what? I'm not sure how to answer your question, but I'll do some study and I'll find a better answer than, well, Old Testament doesn't count, because it does count. It counted so much that it was essentially a 2,000-year foundation for our faith system. The things we say we believe, the way Jesus lived and taught, were only true because of what we find in these books. So I just wanted to stop for a second because it's been interesting to watch these atheist teachers essentially say, I always stump Christians and I always use this question and this is always how they respond. Right? Man, let's do better than that as we, find ourselves in these conversations. So thanks for that aside, for letting me kind of dive into that a little bit. I want us to spend some time talking about the story of Samson. Now, if you don't know the story of Samson, you're gonna over the next couple of weeks. But the story of Samson is fascinating, and it's fascinating for a bunch of different reasons. There is all kinds of really cool stuff that happens in the story of Samson. The story of Samson is actually one of the longest stories we find in the book of Judges. It takes up 4 entire chapters. And I want us to spend some time today talking about not only the background of the story of Samson, but also some of the background of the book of Judges. So we're going to dive into this kind of right out of the gate. There was by painting some of the Old Testament history that led us to this point. So over the last 6 weeks, we've been having conversations about characters from the book of Genesis. And we spent a couple weeks talking about Abraham, and we watched as Abraham and his son Isaac begin to create what we now know of as the nation of Israel, what our Old Testament refers to as the nation of Israel. Abraham was the founding father. He was the first man who started the nation of Israel. And through his descendants, this nation grew. And we watched as God actually told Abraham, look, your descendants are going to go into slavery for 400 years, but I'm going to bring them out of slavery, and then they will be a people. I will give them a land. We saw these things happen. As that story traces itself forward, most of us probably know some of kind of the overarching stories in the Old Testament. But so we find Moses then leads God's people out of slavery in Egypt, and he essentially becomes the head of the nation of Israel and leads them. Moses eventually dies and hands the reins of leadership over to Joshua. And the book of Judges, where the book of Judges begins, we find that Joshua is now dying, and God is establishing how he's going to continue to lead his people after the death of Moses and the death of Joshua. So the book of Judges, the first 3 chapters actually explain to us what's happening here. That God is going to demonstrate his ability to continue to guide his people by transitioning his leadership well over the nation. And so we're going to start by looking at a passage in Judges chapter 2. Man, I realize a handful of you are probably at work or in different places. If you've got a Bible, I'm going to do some reading. So it may be helpful to grab one, even if you've got a walk away for a minute and pick one up and come back. But we're in Judges chapter 2. And in Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 16, we get the outline of the book. Okay, he's going to explain to us how this is going to work. And it says this: "The Lord raised up judges who saved them," meaning the nation of Israel, "who saved them out of the hands of these raiders," these bad guys. Okay? "Yet the people would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. Unlike their fathers, they quickly turned away from the way in which their fathers had walked, the way of obedience to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved the nation of Israel out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord had compassion on them as they groaned under those who oppressed and afflicted them." I'm at verse 19. "But when the judge died, the people returned to the ways even more corrupt than those of their fathers, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and their stubborn ways." Now I'm going to stop right there, because what we find in this little section of Judges is that the book of Judges is going to follow a pattern. And I want us to outline it together because it will hopefully make sense as we watch it unfold throughout the rest of the book. Not only just the story of Samson that we're going to look at, but even as you study the book of Judges on your own. And what happens is there's this moment in the nation of Israel that will happen over and over again, but we're going to call it apostasy. It's a moment of apostasy, of disregard for the law of God and what God has commanded his people to do. And so in the book of Judges, that usually shows up like it just did in chapter 2 with the language that goes something like, these people stopped listening to their judges and they prostituted themselves to other gods. Okay, so there's this moment of apostasy in the nation. That apostasy is always followed by oppression. So another nation will come in and take over the nation of Israel. So the people betray their relationship, their covenant with God, and then another nation comes in to oppress them. After that happens, now the nation of Israel, sometimes it only happens for 2 or 3 years in the book. Sometimes it lasts for 40 or even 80 years that these people are living under the oppression of another nation. Well, after the oppression, eventually the people wise up and they cry to God for help. God, we're tired of living as slaves. Please come help us. Okay? When this happens, God raises up a leader. And the leader ends up delivering the people. That's the last point, is deliverance. He ends up delivering the people from the nation that is oppressing them. Okay, now, this 5-point pattern happens over and over and over again. And what's interesting is, in every story in the book of Judges, in some of them, you will find all 5 of these outlined perfectly. We're going to look at one of those in just a minute so you can see exactly how this thing works itself out. But in every story, there's at least 1, most of the time 3, and a lot of times 4 or 5 of these points show up in every single story. So the writer essentially used a pattern to show us how the people are continuing this cycle: apostasy, oppression. They cry out to God for help. God raises up a leader to rescue them. He delivers them out of the hands of whoever is oppressing them. And then we sort of, to quote James Randall, we wash, rinse, and repeat, right? We just start over again. Okay, so there's this pattern. Now, I want us to jump just quickly to Judges chapter 3. And we're going to start in verse 7. Now, this is actually the story of a judge. His name is Othniel, and we're going to read it. It's literally 11 verses long, it's like 4 verses long. So we're going to read these 4 verses from 3:7 to 3:11. "The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God, and they served the Baals and the Asherahs." They started worshiping other gods. Guess what? Apostasy. Right? Verse 7, find apostasy. Verse 8, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, the king of Aram-Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. Oppression. Okay, verse 8. Now we're at verse 9. But when they cried out to the Lord, cry for help, he raised for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz. God raises a leader, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. Verse 10, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. And the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. Deliverance. Verse 11, so the land had peace for 40 years until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. Now this little section here in chapter 3 is the perfect straw man. It does exactly what we've just said. And then you'll see that these same phrases are going to repeat themselves in the lives of the judges that come after these, and all of the judges that come after. Now, one of the things that is definitely interesting about this particular story is it wraps it all up really nicely for us. You can see all 5 of these points before it starts all over again in verse 12. In verse 12 of chapter 3, we get, once again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And this is how the stories always start. This is kind of that wash, rinse, repeat thing. God steps in. He raises up a leader. The leader delivers the people from the oppression of the nation that's overtaken them. And then the people fall right back into their sin after they're delivered, and we start all over again. Now, when we get to the story of Samson, the story of Samson actually begins in chapter 13. I'm just going to flip there. When we get to the story of Samson, the story of Samson starts exactly like we would expect it to. Okay? Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So at the very beginning of the story of Samson, we find that we're starting our pattern all over again. Okay? And so what should we expect? Well, we should expect that God is that from this apostasy, there's going to come oppression, which we just found, right? God delivers them into the hands of the Philistines. The people are eventually going to cry out for help, like, God, help us. God is going to raise up a leader to interact on their behalf, and that leader is going to deliver them from the hands of the oppressor. Now, there are a couple other things that I want to point out as we dive into this real quick. First of all, in almost every scenario in the book of Judges, when God raises up a leader, the leader leads the army of Israel. Okay? So, and what's interesting is the word judges in our text, when it first shows up in chapter 2, some Bibles will have a footnote. It just tells you the word judge is actually leader. Okay? So that's why we're using this language. But so God raises up a leader who leads the army of Israel into battle to defeat the oppressor. That structure is going to shift just a little bit with Samson, and I think it's one of the things that makes the story of Samson really interesting and unique. We'll definitely get into some of that. One of the things that I want to talk about as we continue to look at the background of Samson is I found a commentary, one of the most famous commentaries that's being used right now in seminaries. And when I opened it to the story of Samson, the description of the story of Samson said this, verbatim: self-centered fight with Philistines and women. So his description of what we're going to tackle in the story of Samson is that we are going to find a self-centered fight on the part of Samson against the Philistines, and he's going to have some kind of consistent self-centered interaction with women. Now, I think it's very possible for us to read the story of Samson. I'm going to go over it real briefly here in just a second, start to finish, but to read the story of Samson and get this impression. Because we find at the end of chapter 13, Samson is born. He's born with miraculous human strength. Okay? Most of the time when we hear about Samson, this is what we hear, right? He's this miraculously strong guy. So he's born with this miraculous human strength. And Samson ends up falling in love with a Philistine woman. Now, the Philistine are the oppressors of Israel, right? This is kind of a weird turn of events. He falls in love with this Philistine woman, and she ends up getting killed by her own people. Samson's mad, so he kills a bunch of Philistines in response. As the story continues, we find Samson in love again with another Philistine woman. This is the story of Samson and Delilah, the famous story where Samson gets his head shaved. Most of us know this, right? So we find Samson again has this interaction where he falls in love with this woman, marries her, but she's a Philistine. So he's in this constant war with the Philistine oppressors, and it's personal for him. They killed his first wife. She was one of them, for heaven's sake. And then he kind of repeats this cycle again, falls in love with another Philistine woman. Only this Philistine woman betrays him. They end up shaving his head. He loses all of his miraculous strength when his head gets shaved. And eventually, this leads him to his death. Okay? It also eventually leads to the deliverance of the people, but we'll get into some of that. Now, the reason I do the story in these broad strokes is because it's easy to look at this and go, man, Samson has this very selfish desire for women. This is true. It's true in the text. We watch it play out. He's got this desire for these Philistine women, which makes no sense. It was kind of offensive to the rest of his people, including his mom and dad. When they find out he's in love with this Philistine woman, they're like, what are you doing? Stop this. You've lost your mind, essentially. So there is this selfish motive that happens in the background that's driving him to chase these women. And then we watch him attack the Philistines. He slaughters hundreds of them alone. This is interesting because this is one of the things that breaks the pattern of what we see in Judges. Samson doesn't lead the army of Israel. He takes care of these people by himself. It's an interesting point we'll play with later. But so it's easy for us to watch this play out and come to the conclusion that, man, Samson's this super selfish guy, kills all these Philistines out of selfish ambition and rage. He wants to womanize with all of these Philistine women. And I'm not sure how else to say that I think that is a terrible way to tackle the story of Samson. And we're going to spend a little time today talking about why I think that's a terrible way to tackle the story of Samson, because I think it reflects some of what we were talking about right out of the gate. It reflects a misunderstanding of what we as Christians can find and understand in our Old Testament. It reflects a very, sorry to the scholar who wrote Word Biblical Commentary, but it reflects what I believe to be a very naive understanding of how the Old Testament should work in the life of a believer. And so we're going to dive into the story of Samson at chapter 13. And chapter 13 is 25 verses long, and I'm going to read it. So bear with me. If you have a Bible, follow along. Chapter 13, verse 1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now a certain man of Zorah, that was a town, a city, named Manoah, from the clan of the Danites, had a wife who was sterile and remained childless. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are sterile and childless, but you are going to conceive and have a son. Now see to it that you drink no wine or other fermented drink, and that you do not eat anything unclean, because you will conceive and give birth to a son. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, set apart to God from birth, and he will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." Then the woman went to her husband and told him, "A man of God came to me. He looked like an angel of God, very awesome. I didn't ask him where he came from, and he didn't tell me his name. But he said to me, 'You will conceive and give birth to a son. Now then, drink no wine or other fermented drink, and do not eat anything unclean, because the boy will be a Nazirite of God from birth until the day of his death.' Then Manoah prayed to the Lord, O Lord, I beg you, let the man of God you sent to us come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born. God heard Manoah, and the angel of God came again to the woman while she was out in the field, but her husband Manoah was not with her. The woman hurried to tell her husband, he's here, the man who appeared to me the other day. And Manoah got up and he followed his wife. And when he came to the man, he said, are you the one who talked to my wife? I am, he said. So Manoah asked him, when your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule for the boy's life and work? And the angel of the Lord answered, your wife must do all that I have told her. She must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, nor drink any wine or other fermented drink, nor eat anything unclean. She must do everything I have commanded her. Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, we would like you to stay until we prepare a young goat for you. Then the angel of the Lord replied, even though you detain me, I will not eat any of your food, but if you prepare a burnt offering, offer it to the Lord. Manoah did not realize that it was the angel of the Lord. And then Manoah inquired of the angel of the Lord, what is your name, so that we may honor you when your words come true? And he replied, why do you ask my name? It is beyond understanding. And then Manoah took a young goat together with the grain offering and sacrificed it on a rock to the Lord. And the Lord did an amazing thing while Manoah and his wife watched. As the flame blazed up from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. Seeing this, Manoah and his wife fell with their faces to the ground. And when the angel of the Lord did not show himself again to Manoah and his wife, Manoah realized that it had been the angel of the Lord. We're doomed to die, he said to his wife. We have seen God. But his wife answered, if the Lord had meant to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and grain offering from our hands, nor shown us all these things, or told us this. And the woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. He grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he was in Manaah Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Now I want us to stop here because we're going to spend probably the rest of our time together today talking about what we find in this chapter. First of all, like we'd already mentioned, in chapter 13, verse 1, we find the apostasy, the Israelites do evil in the eyes of the Lord. We find the oppression. The Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines. At the very end of chapter 13, in verse 24 and 25, God raises up a leader for the people. Right? It's Samson. The woman gave birth to a boy and named him Samson. Now, I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about what the heck is happening in chapter 13. Because normally these first four sections of our structure happen very, very quickly. In this one, there are a couple of these that happen, and then there's this ginormous pause where we find out an angel shows up and tells this lady she's getting ready to give birth to a son. Now, believe it or not, this piece of the story is one of the reasons I have such a massive problem with an interpretation of the story that simply says Samson's this selfish guy that kills a bunch of Philistines and likes chicks, right? And here's why. In our entire book, the entire book that is our scriptures, there are only 5 instances where an angel shows up and says a baby's going to be born. Only happens 5 times. It happens in the story of Ishmael, which we looked at. We didn't really get into a ton. But this is Abraham's son through his slave Hagar. It happens in the story of Isaac. Isaac, as most of us know if you've been following along, Isaac is Abraham's son through Sarah. So Abraham's 2 sons, okay, this guy that God had made a pact with and said he would bless the entire world through, his 2 sons are both announced, their births are both announced by an angel. When you jump way forward into the New Testament, we find that there are 2 guys whose births are announced by an angel. Right? The first one is John the Baptist, the precursor to Jesus. We're going to call him John the B because save myself a second there. The second one is Jesus himself. Okay, so, man, it's hard to argue that there are that it's possible to find 4 more prominent players in the scriptures than what we've just talked about. Abraham's 2 sons, births are both announced by angels. John the Baptist, the man who came before the Christ to announce he was coming, and then Jesus shows up. Their births are both announced by angels. And interestingly, right here in the middle of these 2 and this pair of birth announcements and another pair of birth announcements, we find Samson. And if I said nothing that sounded educated or remotely smart, this structure right here, where we go 1, 2, Samson, 1, 2, we don't find patterns like this in the scripture and have them be meaningless. Unfortunately, I can't tell you what it means because I'm not entirely sure. But there's something to this that's interesting, right? It's an interesting little thing to note. Okay? Now, so there are only 5 people in the entire book where an angel shows up and says, you're going to have a baby. And this baby matters. This baby is important, right? The fact that Samson is one of them means there's something happening in the story of Samson that we need to pay attention to. It's got to be more than just selfish guy shows up, beats up some bad guys, loves women, right? So there's something else happening here. One of the things that we see in chapter 13 that pops up over and over again is the angel tells Mama, hey, Mom, your son has to be a Nazirite. He's going to be a Nazirite from birth. And because of that, here's how you have to live. Okay? In fact, if I had to guess, I would guess that when she goes back and tells Manoah, hey, an angel just showed up. He said we have to raise a Nazirite. Manoah's like, I don't even know what that word means. Right? Send us the angel back, God. Somebody come and explain this. Now, the idea of a Nazirite is not new with this chapter. It's actually from the book of Numbers, and I want us to take a minute and flip there as well. So like I said earlier, if you've got a Bible with you, we're going to do some jumping around. But we are in Numbers chapter 6. And in Numbers chapter 6, God is giving commands to the people through Moses, and he's essentially explaining to them how he wants them to live and how they are to offer sacrifices and spend their lives pursuing him. And in Numbers chapter 6, we find verse 1, we find these words. The Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man or a woman wants to make a special vow, a vow of separation to the Lord as a Nazirite, he must abstain from wine or other fermented drink, and he must not drink vinegar made from wine or other fermented drink. He must not drink grape juice or eat grapes or raisins. As long as he is a Nazirite, he must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, not even the seeds or the skins. During the entire period of his vow of separation, no razor may be used on his head. He must be holy until the period of his separation to the Lord is over. He must let the hair of his head grow long. Throughout the period of his separation to the Lord, he must not go near a dead body. Even if it's his own father or mother or brother or sister that dies, he must not make himself ceremonially unclean on account of them, because the symbol of his separation to God is on his head. Throughout the period of his separation, he is consecrated to the Lord. Now, I'm going to stop right here. This continues. Almost the entire chapter 6 is dedicated to explaining the Nazirite vow. Now, what's interesting, though, about this is for the nation of Israel, the Nazirite vow was something that you chose. It was a decision you made. And it was understood later, as you kind of dive into this particular vow, it was understood later that it was for a minimum of 30 days. So anyone could say, I want to make a special declaration, essentially, to be set apart for God. I want to create a unique relational bond between God and I. And I'm going to do that by taking this vow of separation. And when I do, essentially 2 big things have to happen. Let me alter my 2 big things because it's 2, but we're going to make it 3. Okay, so number 1, I can't eat anything that's grape related. If it's a grape, I can't touch it. Skins, seeds, raisins, dried out grapes, grapes that have been juiced, grape juice. The second piece of that, which is essentially all one thing, but we can break it into two pieces, is I can't have anything fermented, no alcohol. Okay. It's an abstinence not only from grapes, which typically symbolize like the sweet best there is. Okay, so I'm essentially saying I will give up sweet, delicious things. Okay, and then in addition to that, I won't take anything fermented. I will not drink any alcohol. So that's part one. Part two, which seems a little odd, frankly, to me, I've studied it a bunch. So kind of in our modern day mind, it seems a little strange. But the second piece of this covenant is I will not cut my hair. So a Nazirite was visibly distinguishable because if he had done it for a while, he had long hair and a long beard. These were physical signs that I was separating myself for a period of time to the Lord. And again, that period of time had some play with it. Typically 30 days was where you started, and you could actually make a Nazirite vow for less than 30 days. But if you did, the priests and the rulers would essentially say, like, yeah, man, you said 2 weeks, it's 30 days. Welcome to it, right? This was the beginning point. And you could make it for as long or as short a period of time as you wanted. Now, there are essentially two kinds of Nazirite vows that we find in the text. The first one was this kind where I made a conscious, willing decision to say I will be a Nazirite for 3 months or 2 years or 30 days. For whatever reason, I've decided I want to make this special vow to be separate for the Lord, and I'm going to do it for X period of time. Then there was also a Nazirite vow that was essentially a permanent lifestyle decision. Okay? And this is essentially what we find happening with Samson. Samson makes a permanent lifestyle decision to never cut his hair, to never cut his beard, to consume no fruit of the grapevine and no fermented drink. Now, in the nation of Israel, it was a little it sounds like from what I've studied that it was less common for someone to make a permanent Nazirite vow. At some point, that's kind of tough, right? You can never cut your hair, you can never cut your beard, you can never eat grapes, you can never drink wine. But people did it, okay? So they did make this permanent vow. The interesting thing for me about Samson is he didn't choose, right? It was chosen for him. This lifestyle was handed to him. An angel of God shows up and says, guess what? You're going to have a son, and he has to live this way. That's an interesting thing. So Samson is born into this vow. In fact, not only that, but his mom essentially had to take the same vow just to be able to carry him. So when the text tells us in Judges 13 that Samson is going to be a Nazirite, this is what it means. It means he will never cut his hair. It means he will never cut his beard. It means he will never drink wine or taste fermented food or drink, and he will never eat grapes or fruit from the vine. Now, I have managed to talk myself all the way out of time, and we haven't even made it through chapter 13 yet. But this Nazirite vow, the thing I want to hang on just for a second before we bail, the thing that's interesting about the Nazirite vow is the word Nazirite comes from the Greek word nazar. Nazar is essentially the root means to observe. It can mean to guard, but typically it means like I'm going to observe a ritual of some kind. Okay, so Nazirite carries this idea of an observation of a special vow to God. Now, we find in Matthew chapter 3 that there's a passage, Matthew quotes a passage from Isaiah that says, essentially says, Jesus moves to Nazareth, and he lives in Nazareth, and that move fulfills a prophecy from Isaiah that said Jesus would be a Nazarene. What's interesting about that is same root, nazar, right? To observe. And although, and no one thinks Jesus took this strict Nazirite vow because we're told he consumed wine. One of the things that's interesting is the people who lived and wrote about Jesus within that first 100 years after his death all talked about the fact that this quote from Matthew may not have been a reference to a physical location of Nazareth, but it may have been a reference to the type of vow that Jesus would have made to set himself apart to God as a Nazirite. And the reason I find that so fascinating is because it starts to point to some other connection to Samson, between Samson and Jesus, that may have been bigger than just Samson was this guy who liked to kill Philistines and he, loved their women. So we're going to stop right there. We're going to pick back up. There are a couple more things next week as we dive into this, I want us to notice about the birth story of Samson. And then we're going to move on, and we should make it most of the way through the story of Samson next week with any luck. So thanks for hanging with us today. We'll have this video posted on YouTube tomorrow. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. We'll see you right back here next Wednesday.